Our notes tonight are some key vocabulary for the first unit of the new semester, covering the early Cold War. Starting with the term itself, Cold War, which means the hostile but non-violent struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union as well as their allies in the period after World War II up to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It's almost an oxymoron, right? Cold War. So it is a definite struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but we call it cold because it never actually resulted in direct fighting between the two main countries. Number two is the Truman Doctrine, named after this guy here, President Harry Truman. A doctrine simply means a statement of policy. So in this case, the Truman Doctrine was a U.S. foreign policy established by Truman that provided economic and military aid to countries who were attempting to resist communism. So Truman establishes this policy saying the U.S. will help countries who are attempting to resist communism. Number three, the Iron Curtain refers to the ideological barrier between Eastern and Western Europe during the Cold War. Ideological because it's not a physical barrier, right? It's talking about the dividing line between the Soviet-controlled communist countries in the East and the democratic countries of Western Europe. The Marshall Plan was the U.S. plan to help the economic recovery of Europe after World War II. And so the picture here shows, for example, a shipment of sugar the U.S. was sending to Europe to help rebuild. And on the flip side of that was the Molotov Plan, which was the Soviet plan to aid in the economic recovery of Eastern Europe. So one of the things we'll see is that during the Cold War, whenever one side would come up with a new idea or a new plan or a new weapon, the other side was quick to try to copy that. And so we see that here. Number six is the Berlin Blockade. The Berlin Blockade, it's kind of a longer definition, refers to the Soviet blockade of Berlin that went for about a year. And it was aimed at forcing the U.S. and its allies, Britain and France, to give up their plan to unite Germany into a democratic country after the war. And the Allied nations resisted this, as you can see in the picture, by airlifting food and supplies into the city of Berlin. Number seven, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. This was a military alliance that the U.S. was in. So it's between the U.S. and its allies, military alliance to provide collective security against the Soviets. And just like we saw with the Marshall Plan and the Molotov Plan, the Soviets copy that and come up with their own. Theirs was called the Warsaw Pact. This was a military alliance between the Soviets and its allies for mutual defense. And so you see in the picture, the dark blue, those would be the NATO countries, the red, the Warsaw Pact countries. The Korean War, a war fought on the Korean Peninsula in 1950-1953 between the communist North, who was backed by the Soviets, and the democratic South Korea, backed by the United States and the United Nations. Number 10, Mutual Assured Destruction, or better known by its acronym MAD. This was the idea that the United States or the Soviets would respond to a nuclear attack by launching its own weapons. And this, strange as it sounds, actually helped prevent the Cold War from turning into a hot war, right? Both sides understood that if they launched their missiles, they would get attacked in return. So mutual assured destruction. Both sides knew that a missile launch would result in their own destruction as well. Made both sides think twice. Communist sympathizer, a person who believes in communist ideology but is not a member of the Communist Party. As we'll learn, that was a real worry in the U.S. in the late 40s and in the 50s. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or the HUAC, was a committee of the U.S. House of Representatives that investigated subversive organizations in the United States until 1975. Subversive simply means rebellious, right? So sort of illegal or rebellious organizations in the U.S. Related to that is the last one, McCarthyism, which refers to the practice of publicly accusing people of subversive or rebellious activities without actually having any evidence to back up the charges. It's named after this guy right here, Senator Joe McCarthy, who famously did that in the 1950s. He would accuse people of being communists or being communist sympathizers and never really had any evidence to back those charges up, but it stirred up a lot of fear. Make sure we get the definitions down and print those off prior to coming to next class.